The first time Owen Chandler saw the scar on Yatul Bloodhorn's cheek, he thought it was a wound that needed tending, and he reached for his medicine tin before she could stop him. He had been splitting wood behind his homestead when she came out of the pine tree line at the edge of his property, moving with the careful, measured gait of a person who had learned to make themselves small in a world that did not welcome them. The afternoon sun was low and amber over the Broken Ridge territory, turning the frost on the grass to copper, and the mountains to the north were already purple with early winter shadow. Owen straightened, axe still in hand, and watched her come. She was tall, nearly a full head above him, and she moved with the kind of physical grace that only came from years of hard country living. Her skin was a deep sage green, and her dark hair was pulled back from her face in a long practical braid that had come half loose and fell over one broad shoulder. She wore a fitted leather bodice over a dark linen shirt, the laces tight across the chest and waist, and snug trail leathers tucked into worn knee boots that had seen 100 miles at minimum. The leather bodice was etched in a repeating pattern along the edges, something tribal and precise, and despite the plain practicality of the clothing, it fit her in a way that made her look formidable and striking at once. Over it all she had a short travel cloak, and it was hanging by a single clasp because the other had torn away, leaving her right shoulder uncovered to the cold air. She carried nothing but a water skin and a small blade at her hip, and she held both hands slightly away from her body in the universal gesture of someone who did not want to be perceived as a threat. Her tusks were modest, ivory-white, curving slightly upward from her lower jaw, and they gave her face a serious, almost regal set. And there on her right cheek was a scar, not ragged, not torn, but precise and deliberate, a pattern of 2 curved lines and 3 short marks between them, etched into her skin with something sharp and careful. Owen looked at it and thought, "Infection, old wound, needs cleaning." He set down his axe. "You are bleeding," he said. Yatul stopped walking. She looked at him with dark amber eyes that held a considerable amount of wariness, and then a flicker of something else that might have been confusion. "I am not bleeding," she said. Her voice was low and controlled, her human tongue clean and precise with the slight lilt of someone who had learned it as a second language. "Your cheek," Owen said. He pulled the medicine tin from his back pocket, an old reflex, a frontier habit. He had spent 3 years trapping and 2 years homesteading alone out here in the Broken Ridge country, and you either learned to tend wounds or you died slow. "Let me clean it." She stared at him. He took a step toward her and she took a step back, her hand dropping to the small knife at her hip, not drawing it but touching it. "It is not a wound," she said. Owen stopped. He looked more carefully at the marks on her cheek, and something in his chest shifted because he could see now, in the better light, that the scar was too precise to be accidental. The lines were even. The marks between them were intentional. "Oh," he said. He felt heat crawl up the back of his neck. "I am sorry. You thought wrong," she said, but there was no heat in it, just exhaustion. She looked past him at the cabin with its smoking chimney and its lamplit window. And then she looked back at him with those amber eyes, and she said, "I have been walking since before dawn. I need water and a direction to the next settlement, and then I will be gone from your land." Owen looked at the sky. The sun was dropping fast now, and the temperature was dropping with it. The next settlement was Calderford, and it was 2 hours on horseback in good weather, which meant it was 5 hours on foot in the cold dark. And the last orc woman who had tried to walk into Calderford alone had been run out by 3 men with lanterns before she got to the main road. He was not that kind of man. He had never been that kind of man. He was not entirely sure how he had ended up alone in the Broken Ridge country, except that the world closer to town had always felt like a pair of boots that didn't fit, too tight, rubbing wrong, and out here with the mountains and the pines and the frost-edged silence he could breathe. "Come inside," he said. "I have water and there is supper on the fire. You can rest here tonight and I will ride you toward Calderford in the morning." She looked at him with a flat, measuring expression that made it entirely clear. She was cataloging every possible way this offer could turn dangerous. He held the medicine tin in one hand and did not move because he understood that the best thing he could do was be still and not crowd her. "Why?" she said. Not a question exactly. A demand for honesty. He thought about it. "Because it is cold," he said, "and the ridge country is no place to walk alone at night, and because I already put my foot in my mouth once tonight by trying to treat your face like an injury, so I owe you at least a meal." Something in her expression shifted. Not softened exactly, more like it reconsidered. "Your name," she said. "Owen Chandler." She watched him for another moment. The wind moved through the pines. The temperature had already dropped 5 degrees while they stood there. "Yatul Bloodhorn," she said, and she walked past him toward the cabin door. He caught up and reached the door first, opened it, and she paused in the doorway with her hand on the frame and looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read, and then she stepped inside. The cabin was small and lived in and warm, with a stone fireplace along the south wall and a rough table with 2 mismatched chairs and a sleeping cot along the north wall. There were furs stacked near the fire, trapping gear hung on pegs by the door, and a cookpot hanging over the flames that smelled of venison stew. It was the kind of home that told you everything about its owner: careful, self-sufficient, not wealthy but not careless either. Maps tacked to the wall, a shelf of medicine tins and plant bundles, tools that were clean and properly stored. Yatul stood just inside the door and looked at the room the way she had looked at him outside, taking inventory, measuring angles, noting exits. Then she found the chair farthest from the door and sat in it with her back to the wall. Owen set the medicine tin back on its shelf without comment and ladled 2 bowls of stew from the pot. He set one in front of her and sat across from her and ate without staring at her, because he understood instinctively that being watched while you ate was its own kind of threat. She ate. She ate with the focused intensity of someone who had not had a proper meal in too long, and when she finished, she set the bowl down and looked at him with slightly less wariness than before. "You live alone out here," she said. "Yes." "For how long?" "5 years, give or take. And you are not afraid of me." He looked up from his bowl. "Should I be?" She thought about that. "Most men in your position would be." "Most men in my position would have left the door shut," he said. "I am not most men." She studied him. The fire crackled. Outside the wind was picking up, rattling the window glass, and the temperature was falling fast. He could hear the change in the air that meant snow was coming before morning. "Where are you traveling to?" he asked. There was a pause, a short silence that contained a great deal. "The clan I was riding with crossed the Redstone Pass 3 days ago," she said. "They were heading south to the winter territory. There was a disagreement about the route. I took the northern path. They took the southern. We did not meet again at the point we had planned." He listened to the careful way she said this and understood there was more to it than a navigation argument, but he did not push. "Calderford is not a welcoming town," he said. "I know. There is a trading post at Misread, another day's ride northwest. They are more practical there, less interested in who is buying and more interested in what coin looks like." "I know Misread," she said. "I passed through it 2 winters ago." Owen nodded. He began to ask something else and then stopped, because there was a particular expression on her face that had appeared when she mentioned the 2 winters ago, something that went through quickly like a shadow across water and was gone. "You can take the cot," he said instead. "I have furs enough to sleep by the fire." She looked at him. "You are giving a stranger your bed." "I am giving a guest the cot," he said. "It is not complicated." Yatul watched him for a long moment, and then she said quietly, "You are a very strange man, Owen Chandler." "I have heard that before," he said, and he poured 2 tin cups of the bitter chicory tea he had been brewing and pushed one across the table toward her, and she looked down at it and then picked it up. And outside the snow began to fall in the dark and the fire burned warm between them. By morning the snow was 4 inches deep and still coming down, and it was clear neither of them was going anywhere that day. Owen discovered this at first light when he opened the cabin door and found a white silence that stretched to the tree line and was still thickening. He stood in the doorway in his boots and his heavy wool shirt and assessed the situation with the practiced calm of someone who had weathered 5 ridge winters. Then he came back inside and built up the fire and found Yatul already awake, sitting on the edge of the cot with her travel cloak pulled around her shoulders, watching him with those amber eyes. 2 days at least, he said, before this road is passable. She said nothing. She looked at the window where the snow was pressing against the glass. I'm going to check the animals, he said. I have 3 horses and a pair of goats in the outbuilding. You are welcome to stay or come. She came. He had not expected that. She pulled the cloak tighter and followed him out into the white morning, and he handed her a shovel without commentary, and she used it without commentary, and between them they cleared the path to the outbuilding in 15 minutes. Inside, the horses were shifting in their stalls, and the goats were making their particular complaints, and Owen moved through the animals with the ease of long habit, measuring out feed and checking water, and talking quietly to the horses in the way that people who lived alone in the country often talked to their animals, softly and without self-consciousness. He noticed Yatul watching the horses with something that was not quite the wariness she wore everywhere else. He noticed the way she kept herself back from the nearest stall, not out of fear, but out of a kind of respect for the animal's space. "Do you ride?" he asked. "Yes, I lost my horse 3 days ago." A creek crossing that went wrong, another of those careful statements with a great deal behind them. "I am sorry," he said, and meant it plainly. She looked at him. "You mean that?" "Why would I not mean it?" She shook her head slightly, not answering, and went back to looking at the horses. He watched her face for a moment and saw something in the quality of her stillness, the way she was holding very controlled breath, and he understood that she had lost more than a horse in the last few days, and that she was not ready to talk about it. They worked together in the outbuilding for another half-hour, and by the time they went back inside, Owen had decided simply to be useful and patient and not ask too many questions, because that seemed to be what the situation called for. Over the following day and a half, they established a quiet rhythm. Owen worked inside, mending harness leather and sharpening trapping tools, and Yatul sat across the table from him and sorted and repaired the few things she had in her pack: a broken strap on the water skin, a split seam in the lining of the cloak. They talked in intervals, not the filling silence kind of talk, but the kind that happened when something real occurred to one of them. "The scar on your cheek," Owen said on the second evening before he could think better of it. "What does it mean, in your culture?" He expected the shuddered look. Instead, she touched her cheek with one finger, not self-consciously but thoughtfully, like touching something familiar and significant. "It is a blood claim marker," she said. "In the old tradition, it means the bearer has been chosen by someone of the clan, bound to them formally." Owen turned this over in his mind. "Like a marriage mark." "Not exactly. It is more specific than marriage. It is a claim that goes both ways. The one who gives the mark is saying, 'This person is mine and I am theirs.' It is permanent. It cannot be undone except by the clan elder in formal ceremony." "Who gave it to you?" The silence that followed was its own complete answer. He looked up from the harness leather, and she was looking at the fire, and the quality of her stillness had gone very still indeed. "His name was Breck," she said at last, and she said it the way you say the name of someone you are still learning to keep in the past tense. "He died at Redstone 2 weeks ago." The disagreement about the route was really about what happened after he died. Some of the clan believed the claim mark died with him. Others believed I was still bound by it and should take up with his brother. She paused. I did not agree with either view. I left. Owen was quiet for a moment. He put down the harness leather. "I am sorry," he said, and then carefully, "You are 25, 26. 24, she said. "Old enough to make my own choices. Young enough that the clan thought they could make them for me." He nodded. He was 27 himself, and he understood what it was to be considered young enough to have your choices overridden by people who thought they knew better. "For what it is worth," he said, "from where I am sitting, leaving seems like the right choice." She looked at him then, a direct look, and there was something in it that was neither wariness nor calculation, but something much more human, or at least much more honest. "Thank you," she said. The snow stopped on the third day and the sky cleared hard and bright, the ridge mountains standing out against the blue with the kind of diamond clarity that only came after a good snowfall. Owen packed the saddlebags on the gray mare that he used for long trips and brought her out into the white yard, and Yatul stood in the doorway of the cabin watching him, wearing her cloak properly now, because she had found the second clasp in the pockets of her pack and fixed it in the night. He was going to ride with her to Misread. He had said this plainly, and she had argued against it, briefly and without conviction, and he had explained that he needed to make the Misread run anyway, that his trapping supplies were low, and the winter was going to be long, and she had looked at him with an expression that told him she knew he was at least half making this up, and that she was choosing not to call him on it. He brought out the second horse, a bay gelding he called March, and when Yatul walked out into the yard in her leathers and her cloak with the morning sun hitting the frost on the ground, she looked like something off the old painted tiles they kept in the Calderford Temple, fierce and composed and vivid against all that white. He helped her up onto March, and she took the reins with the confident ease of an experienced rider, and turned the horse's head toward the northwest trail without needing direction, and they rode out through the pine shadows together into the cold, clean morning. The trail to Misread took them through 6 miles of ridge country, broken by a creek crossing, and a long steep climb through a rocky defile that Owen knew well enough to navigate without thinking. He rode just slightly ahead, breaking trail where the snow was deepest, and Yatul rode behind him, and they talked as they rode, voices carrying easily in the cold quiet. She told him about the clan, the Bloodhorn clan, which was one of the older families in the territory, known for being both fierce and practical, traders as much as fighters, with a long history of moving between the mountain territories and the lowland, passes that the human settlements used for commerce. She talked about her childhood moving between winter and summer grounds, about learning the human tongue from a grandmother who had spent 20 years working a trading route near the coast. She did not talk about Breck, except in the way that his death was present in everything she said, the same way a missing tooth is present every time your tongue goes to find it. Owen talked about growing up in the lower settlements, about apprenticing to a blacksmith at 14, and discovering that he was better with animals and land than he was with iron, about 3 years trapping in the Northern Territories and the decision at 22 to use his saved wages on a parcel of land in the Broken Ridge and build something of his own. "You built that cabin yourself?" she asked. "Most of it. My neighbor, Silas Holt, he is 4 miles east. He helped me raise the walls. Good man. Doesn't much care what kind of company I keep." She heard the edge in that last sentence and was quiet for a moment. "Has he seen you keep orc company before?" "No," Owen admitted. "But I know him well enough to be sure he would not make it a trouble." She made a small sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the same territory. The creek crossing was tricky with the snowmelt running it higher than usual, and Owen went first on the gray mare and then came back and rode close alongside March while Yatul crossed, not because she needed help, but because the current was running strong on the left side, and he knew exactly where the footing went soft. He called directions over the sound of the water, and she followed them precisely, and they came out the other side without incident, horses blowing steam in the cold air. And when Owen looked sideways at her, she was looking at him with an expression that was becoming familiar to him, the slight narrowed quality of someone recalibrating their assessment of a person. They reached Misread at midday. The trading post at Misread was exactly as Owen had described it, practical and commercial and populated by people whose first interest was always the transaction at hand. There were 3 wagons in the yard when they rode in, 2 human freighters and 1 belonging to a mixed-race family out of the southern valleys, and there were people moving in and out of the broad double doors of the main store building, with the focused purpose of people who had lists to fill before the next snowfall. There were also, unmistakably, eyes that moved toward Yatul as they rode into the yard. Owen had expected this. He had thought about it on the ride. the way the eyes would move, the way they would track her, and he had made a quiet decision about how he intended to handle it. He dismounted at the hitching post and looped his reins and then went around to where Yatul was still mounted and stood at March's shoulder and looked up at her and said quietly, "Let me go first through the door and speak to Aldrich. He runs the post. He is practical, but he needs to see you come in with me rather than alone. It makes a difference here." She looked down at him. "I have been managing trading posts alone for 6 years, Owen Chandler." "I know," he said. "I am not questioning that. I am asking you to let me be useful because I know this particular man." Another of those long, measuring looks. Then she dismounted with fluid ease and stood beside him. They walked in together. The man behind the trading counter, Aldrich, was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a gray beard and the careful eyes of someone who had been reading people across a counter for 30 years. His gaze went from Owen to Yatul and back to Owen, and then he said, "Chandler," in the tone of a man who was reserving judgment and setting his curiosity aside in favor of business. "Aldrich," Owen said. "I need trail supplies, full winter kit, and the lady needs to trade for provisions and perhaps a horse if you have one going reasonable." The word lady landed in the room exactly as Owen had intended it, not with irony, not with exaggeration, just as a plain descriptor that told everyone in earshot how Owen Chandler was choosing to frame this situation. And a person would have to argue against it explicitly to take a different position, which most practical people were not inclined to do over the counter of a trading post with transactions to complete. Aldrich looked at Yatul with the careful eye of a man deciding something, and then he said, "What do you need, ma'am?" Owen felt Yatul go very still beside him, and he did not look at her face because he thought she might not want to be looked at right then. She traded a set of silver clip buckles and a small package of dried mountain herbs that Aldrich's wife assessed with considerable interest. And she came away with a full provision pack, a wool blanket, and the promise of a young brown mare with a slight leg that was nearly healed, available the following morning for less than the standard going rate, because Aldrich's wife decided she liked the look of the herb package and added it to the deal. Standing in the yard after, with the cold sun moving toward the western peaks and the horses drinking from the trough, Owen said, "We could stay the night at the post hostel, and you can collect the mare in the morning." Yatul looked at the hostel building across the yard, which was also receiving a certain quantity of looks from the people moving around the post, and then she looked back at him. "I would rather camp," she said. He nodded. He did not argue. They rode a mile west of the post to a stand of birch trees along the creek and made camp in the last of the light. Owen built the fire and she set up the bedrolls with the efficient competence of someone who had done it 1,000 times, and they made supper from the new provisions and ate together in the firelight with the creek moving quietly behind them. "You said lady," Yatul said after a while. "I did," Owen said. "You did not have to do that." "No," he agreed. "I chose to." She looked at the fire. The flames were reflecting in her amber eyes, and the scar on her cheek caught the light in a way that made the precise carved lines visible and meaningful. "Why?" she said, in the same tone she had used that first evening, asking why he had invited her in. Not a question exactly, a demand for honesty. Owen thought about it the way he had learned to think about things that mattered, without rushing, without performance, just finding the true answer and saying it. "Because that is what you are," he said. "And because the fact that not everyone in that room would have used that word does not make it less accurate." She was quiet for a very long time. The fire crackled and the creek ran its cold, dark course, and the birch trees stood bone-white against the deep blue of the night sky. "You are still a very strange man," she said, but her voice had changed. The careful measuring quality had gone out of it, and there was something warmer underneath. Owen smiled at the fire. "I have made my peace with that." In the morning she collected the brown mare, which she named Fen in the Orc tongue, because the mare had the same gray-brown color as the marshland grass, and they rode back toward the ridge together. The plan had not been stated explicitly, But Owen was aware that Yatul had no clear destination and no clan to return to, at least not yet. And he was aware that his cabin had a second chair and a cot that he rarely used, and a good deal of winter ahead of it, and that he was not inclined to ride away from Yatul Bloodhorn and put the miles back between them. She seemed to arrive at a similar conclusion by the time they reached the homestead, because when he unsaddled the horses and looked up, she was standing in the yard looking at the cabin with a considering expression, and she said, "I will work for my keep." Owen blinked at her. "I was not planning to charge you." "I know," she said. "But I do not stay places without contributing. I was trained as a tracker and a healer, and I know tanning and leather work. I can work." He opened his mouth and closed it, and then he said, "All right," because he understood that this was important to her, and that it was not about debt. It was about being useful, about being herself in a place rather than simply housed in it. They worked side by side through November and into December, and the rhythm of it surprised Owen with how natural it felt. She was extraordinary at everything she applied herself to. The tracking instinct that came from years of clan work, the healer's knowledge that proved to be considerably more comprehensive than Owen's own field medicine, the leather work that she did with such precision that by mid-November she had resewn and repaired every piece of harness in the outbuilding and half the trapping gear, and had started on a new saddle from the hide Owen had cured that autumn. And she taught him things. She showed him 3 tracking techniques he had never seen that changed his reading of the ridge territory completely, opening up corridors he had not known were there. She showed him a compounding method for the herb pack he kept in the medicine tin that doubled its effectiveness. She showed him that the brown mare Fen had a particular sensitivity to the left shoulder that explained why she had been listed as a problem horse, when in fact she just required a different approach to bridling. Owen watched her work and was continually struck by her, not just by her competence, which was formidable, but by the way she carried herself, the quiet authority of someone who had always had to prove themselves to every room they walked into, and had become so thoroughly capable that proof was simply the default condition of their presence. He was struck by the way she laughed, which happened more as December went on, a low sound, not the kind of laugh designed to charm anyone, just an honest reaction that she was apparently sometimes unable to suppress, and which always made him feel obscurely that he had won something. He was struck by the beauty of her, which he had noticed from the first moment in the yard but had put carefully aside in deference to the situation. She was striking in the way that the Ridge Mountains were striking, not soft, not ornamental, but with a kind of fierce clarity that the eyes kept coming back to. The scar on her cheek, once he understood what it was, had become part of how he read her face, a piece of the story of her written in the most permanent way a person could manage. He had not touched her. He was acutely aware of the careful distance she kept, not cold, just deliberate, the distance of a person who had learned that their space was not always their own to give. He did not crowd it. He passed her things when they worked together, tools and cup and plate, and sometimes their hands were close, and sometimes they were very close, and he kept himself perfectly level because that was what the situation called for, but he was not entirely unaffected. On a night in mid-December when the temperature had dropped hard and the fire was burning high, and they were both sitting at the table after supper with the map spread between them because Owen was planning a spring trapping route, Yatul reached across the table and moved a pin on the map, and in doing so her hand crossed over his and she stopped. They both went very still. Her hand was warm and broad and the fingers were long and capable, and her hand was resting on top of his hand on the map, and neither of them moved for a breath, and then another. "The southern loop is better in spring," she said, her voice perfectly level. "The northern creeks run too high for the first 3 weeks." "Right," Owen said. His voice was also perfectly level, which cost him something. She moved her hand back to her side of the map. They continued the planning session. But when Yatul went to the cot that night and Owen lay by the fire, He lay awake for a considerable time looking at the dark ceiling while the fire burned down and the wind worked at the window, and he thought about the weight of her hand on his and could not quite find his way to sleep. He did not know that she lay awake on the other side of the room for the same reason. The first real trouble came on a market day in late December. Owen had put off the Calderford run for weeks, partly because the roads were difficult and partly because he had been finding reasons to stay close to the homestead. But by the end of December, he needed specific supplies that Misread did not stock, and he made the decision to make the run. Yatul decided to come without, he realized later, quite understanding what Calderford was going to be like, or perhaps with a clearer understanding than he had given her credit for, and an intention to meet it directly. Calderford on market day was the kind of organized human settlement that had spent 20 years deciding exactly where it stood on the question of orc people in its streets, and the answer was not generous. It was not the violently hostile town that existed further east along the ridge, but it was the kind of town where the hostility ran quieter and was therefore in some ways harder to navigate. They rode in on a bright cold morning, the market stalls already busy, smoke from a dozen cook fires rising straight up in the still air, horses and wagons filling the wide main street. Owen pulled up at the farrier's post and dismounted, and was in the middle of tying his horse when he became aware that the quality of the sound around him had shifted. It was a particular kind of shift that anyone who had ever walked into a room as the wrong kind of person would recognize. The conversations did not stop exactly, but they thinned. The attention moved. By the time Owen turned around, Yatul had dismounted beside him and was standing in the middle of the Calderford Market Street, with the morning sun behind her and 20 pairs of eyes on her, and the man running the nearest stall, a big red-faced man named Gorton who Owen knew by reputation as both the town's primary grain merchant and its most committed voice on what he called community standards, was already moving. "We do not serve green skins at this market," Gorton said. He said it loud, the way people said things they wanted to have an audience for, and the audience obliged by going quiet enough to hear the reply. Yatul looked at the man with a steady amber gaze that contained, as far as Owen could see, neither fear nor anger, just the flat assessing quality she had when she was calculating exactly how much of her own response was worth spending. Owen stepped forward. He stepped forward and put himself between Gorton and Yatul, not dramatically, not with theater, just moved his body into the space between them the way you moved your body between an animal and something that was going to frighten it. Except the reason was different. He turned his back to Gorton and looked at Yatul and said, quietly but with complete clarity, "You stay right here. I will handle this." Then he turned to Gorton and said, equally clearly and loudly enough for the audience, "Her name is Yatul Bloodhorn and she is with me, and I have been doing business in this market for 4 years and spending good coin at your stall for 3 of those years, Gorton, and I intend to continue doing so. Are you telling me that is no longer welcome?" Gorton stared at him. The market was very quiet. "She does not belong in Calderford," Gorton said. "She is with me," Owen said again. The third time the word with carried a particular weight that was not entirely about commerce. The quality of the silence changed. Gorton's eyes moved from Owen to Yatul and back to Owen, making a calculation that Owen could read clearly. This was a man who spent money here and who was not being aggressive or theatrical about the thing, he was just being immovable, and immovable was harder to fight than dramatic. "1 hour," Gorton said finally. "Get your business done and go." It was not a victory, it was barely a concession. But Owen nodded once, not gratefully, just acknowledgingly, and turned back to Yatul, and she was looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. It was open in a way her face was rarely open, and it was something he did not have a word for except that it made him feel profoundly and quietly that he had done the right thing. They got the supplies they needed in less than an hour. They rode out of Calderford without looking back. They were a mile down the road before either of them spoke. "You did not have to do that," Yatul said. I keep hearing that from you, Owen said, and I keep meaning the same answer. She was quiet for another few strides of the horses. Then she said, "What is the answer?" He looked over at her, at the scar on her cheek in the winter light, at the amber eyes watching him with their unguarded quality. "That I wanted to," he said. They looked at each other for a long moment, both horses walking steady under them, and then Yatul turned her face forward on the road, and he could see, from the angle, that she was not quite managing to keep the expression entirely closed. January came in hard and brilliant, the coldest in 3 years according to Silas Holt, who came over one morning on snowshoes to borrow a draw knife and found Yatul in the yard repairing a saddle frame, and stood in the snow and had a 10-minute conversation with her about the quality of the leather on the ridge deer versus the mountain deer before he remembered the draw knife and went back to get it and came back and borrowed it and went home. He did not flinch, Yatul said that evening. "I told you," Owen said. "You told me he would not make it a trouble. That is different from not flinching. Silas is a good man." She turned the cup in her hands. "You know quite a few of those," she said, "for someone who lives alone." He looked at her over the fire. "I used to think I was better off alone," he said. "I'm starting to revise that position." She looked at the fire instead of at him, but there was a particular stillness in her that told him she had heard the full weight of the sentence. They had begun to talk in the evenings with the ease of people who have stopped performing and started simply being. She told him about growing up in the Bloodhorn clan, the particular weight of the Bloodhorn name, which was one of the old war names, and carried both pride and expectation in equal measure. She told him about being trained by her grandmother in both the human tongue and the orc craft of tracking healing that had kept the clan's warriors alive through a century of hard mountain winters. She told him about Breck with more words now, slowly, the way a person dismantles a structure that has been load-bearing. He had been the war chief's son, chosen and choice, and the relationship had been arranged before it was loved. And when the love came, it was real, but it had come inside a container made by other people's decisions. And when he died, she had grieved both the man and the understanding that she had never been entirely free inside the thing they shared. "The mark," Owen said one evening carefully. "The blood claim mark, you said it could be undone by the clan elder." "Yes," she said. "Do you want that?" She was quiet then. "I do not know yet. It is still too recent. The mark is his, and that is not nothing." She touched her cheek. "But it is also mine. It is part of my face. I'm not sure I want anyone, including an elder, deciding what that means." He nodded. He understood this completely. He had a long scar of his own down his left forearm from a trapping accident at 19, and the story of it was his, not the accident's. "For what it is worth," he said, "I have never thought of it as a wound." She looked at him quickly and then away, and the line of her jaw was very precise in the firelight. February brought Silas Holt back for the draw knife and 2 other tools, and a visit from a pair of the younger ridge settlers, boys in their early 20s named Tomas and Ren, who came on some thin pretense of checking trail conditions, and spent an uncomfortable 20 minutes in Owen's yard, carefully not looking at Yatul, and then left. Owen did not find this particularly concerning, but Yatul that evening said flatly, "They are going to talk in town." "Let them," Owen said. "It will cause you problems. Then I will address the problems when they come." She set down the leather work and looked at him directly. "Owen, I need you to understand what I am saying. People in towns like Calderford have done worse than talk when a human man takes up with an orc woman. I'm not saying this to be dramatic. I am saying this because you have been very kind to me, and I do not want your kindness to cost you more than you have considered." He held her gaze. "I have considered it," he said. "I am still sitting here." She stared at him. He stared back. The fire between them burned steady and the wind worked at the window, and neither of them broke the gaze for a very long time. Then Yatul picked up the leather work again. "You are the most stubborn person I have ever met," she said, and her voice had that not quite laugh quality. "I come by it honestly," Owen said. In the third week of February, the thing that Yatul had predicted happened, and it happened in a way neither of them had expected. 3 men from Calderford rode up to the homestead on a cold, gray afternoon. Not Gorton's men, but men from the Territorial Oversight Committee, which was a formal-sounding body that in practice meant a group of property owners who had decided they were entitled to regulate the affairs of their neighbors. Their leader was a man named Durrance, a thin-faced man in a good wool coat who had the bearing of someone who had been told he was important enough times to believe it. Owen came out of the cabin when he heard the horses in the yard and stood on the step and watched them ride up. "Chandler," Durrance said, pulling his horse up, "we have had a report about a party of some kind being housed on your property." He looked past Owen at the cabin. "I have a guest," Owen said. "A guest," Durrance repeated, with a particular inflection that made it clear the word was insufficient. "There are community concerns about orc presence in the settled ridge territory, Chandler. The Bloodhorn clan has been working this area and there has been—" "She is not the Bloodhorn clan," Owen said. "She is one person, she is my guest, and the land she is standing on is mine, which means who stands on it is also mine to say." Durrance's jaw tightened. "The committee has the authority to do what?" Owen said flatly. "To come onto a man's private holding and tell him who he may shelter in his own home. I would like to see the document that gives you that authority, Durrance. I would like to read the specific language." Behind him, the cabin door opened. He heard it and did not turn around because he trusted Yatul and because he could tell from Durrance's face what was happening behind him. He heard her footsteps on the step, and then she was beside him, not behind him, not sheltering behind his position but standing level with him in the winter light, wearing her leather bodice and her travel cloak and the expression she wore when she had made a decision about something. "You have a complaint," she said to Durrance. It was not a question. "State it plainly." Durrance stared at her. The 2 men behind him shifted in their saddles. "You are not authorized to speak to this committee," Durrance said. "I am authorized to speak on my own behalf on this man's property," Yatul said. "Your committee has no jurisdiction over me or over his decisions. If you have a legal matter to raise it to the territorial magistrate in Harrogate. Otherwise you are wasting everyone's afternoon." There was a silence. The horse's breath steam in the cold air. Durrance looked at Owen. "This is not over," he said. "Then take it to the magistrate," Owen said. "I look forward to that conversation." They rode out. Owen and Yatul stood side by side in the yard watching them go, and when the horses had disappeared into the tree line, Yatul let out a long, controlled breath. "Well," Owen said. "You were very calm," she said. "You were very calm," he countered. She looked at him sideways. "I have been doing this for 24 years. And I have been doing stubborn for 27, he said. She laughed then, a real laugh, not the contained sound she usually allowed, but a genuine warm burst of it, and it was the most beautiful sound Owen had heard in a very long time. He turned to look at her and she was still laughing, head down slightly, one hand pressed to the scar on her cheek, and when she looked up and found him looking, she did not look away. The laughter faded, but the warmth in her face did not, and they stood in the cold yard in the afternoon light and looked at each other with the particular clear-eyed honesty of 2 people who have stopped pretending they are not aware of what is happening between them. "Owen," she said. "Yes," he said. "I want you to know that I am very aware that this," she gestured between them with a small motion that encompassed everything they were, everything building in the space between them, "is not a small thing. For either of us." "No," he agreed, "it is not. And I am still not entirely sure what I am asking for or what I am able to give right now." He nodded. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you for anything you are not ready to give. I want to be clear about that." She watched him for a long moment. Then she took one step toward him and she reached out and took his right hand in both of hers, and she held it with the same careful, deliberate quality she brought to everything, and she looked at their hands together in the winter light. "I know you are not," she said quietly. "That is part of why I am telling you." He curled his fingers gently around hers, and they stood there in the cold yard with the distant tree line sharp against the gray sky, and the warmth of her hands the warmest thing he had felt in a very long time, and neither of them spoke again for a while, and they did not need to. March arrived like a door being opened. The snow began to pull back from the south-facing slopes, and the pines dripped in the warm afternoons, and the creek behind the homestead ran high and loud, and the light changed, going longer and more golden, and Yatul began to spend more time outside working in a way that told Owen she was breathing differently, easier, the way a person breathes when the cold stops pressing so hard. He watched her work the tanning frame one afternoon in the thin early spring sun, her arms moving with that fluid strength, and he thought about the weeks of winter behind them, the long evenings talking by the fire, the pattern of quiet and work and careful growing nearness, and he thought about the moment in the yard with her hands over his, and he felt the thing he had been feeling since at least January settle into a certainty in his chest that was so solid and clear it was almost alarming. He was in love with Yatul Bloodhorn. He had been for a while. He sat on the step and carved the peg he had been meaning to fix for 3 weeks and looked out at the yard and felt entirely certain and slightly terrified and also, underneath it, deeply and quietly peaceful. He told her that evening, not with a speech, not with arrangement, just directly and plainly, sitting across from her at the table after supper with the spring dark outside the window and the fire burning low. "I love you," he said. "I want you to know that. I am not saying it to push you toward anything. I am saying it because you deserve to know what is true." Yatul set down her cup. She looked at him across the table with those amber eyes that were fully open in the way they had become over these months, the wariness stripped down to almost nothing, and she was quiet for a long time. "I know," she said at last. He waited. "I have known for a while," she said, "and I have been trying to figure out what is fair to tell you back, because there is a great deal in my way, Owen. There is grief, and there is the mark on my cheek, and there is the fact that I have never in my life made a choice about who to love that was entirely my own, and I am determined that if I love you it will be because I chose it cleanly and freely and not because the situation made it the path of least resistance. I would not want it any other way," he said. She looked at him for a very long time. "I know that too," she said. He did not push. He nodded and picked up his cup again, and they sat together in the firelight, and the conversation moved to other things, and nothing was resolved except that everything had been said, and that was enough. 3 nights later she kissed him. It was late and the fire had burned down to coals, and they had both been pretending to sleep for the better part of an hour, him on the floor by the fire and her on the cot. And she got up from the cot and walked across the room to him and knelt beside him in the firelight, and he propped himself up on one arm and looked at her face in the red glow. She put her hand against his jaw. He kept perfectly still. "I chose this," she said, clearly and freely. He put his hand over hers. "I know," he said. She leaned down and kissed him once, soft and deliberate, and he kissed her back the same way, unhurried, holding the moment. And when they drew back she was looking at him with those open amber eyes and something in them that was as close to unguarded as he had ever seen her. "All right," she said softly, as if completing an internal conversation. "All right," he agreed. She did not go back to the cot. She sat beside him in the firelight, and they talked quietly until the coals were gray, and the spring night was cold around the edges of the warmth. And then she fell asleep beside him with her head against his shoulder, and he lay awake for a long time feeling the warm, settled weight of her, and listening to the sound of the creek running high outside. And he did not think he had ever been so completely aware of being exactly where he was supposed to be. April came, and with it a stranger riding a fast horse, a young orc rider who came up the trail from the south one morning, while Owen was in the field breaking the first of the spring ground for planting, and Yatul was in the outbuilding with the horses. The rider pulled up in the yard and looked around, and then caught sight of Yatul coming out of the outbuilding, and the relief on his face was evident. His name was Savat, and he was 17 years old and had been riding for 3 days, and he was from the Bloodhorn clan. Owen came in from the field and found them in the yard. Yatul with her arms crossed and the steady expression she wore when she was managing a strong reaction, and Savet talking fast in the orc tongue with his hands moving and his horse still breathing hard from the road. Yatul turned when Owen came into the yard and she translated without preamble. "The clan elder, Grandmother Verk, wants to meet with me. She has sent Savet to find me. She has something to say about the claim mark." Owen looked at the young rider and then at Yatul. What does she want to say? Savet does not know the full content. He says only that Verk says it is important and that it is about choice. Her voice was carefully neutral. Owen waited. "She is 3 days' ride south," Yatul said, "at the winter camp near Godsfall Creek." "Do you want to go?" Owen said. She looked at him. "I want to go if you come with me." He looked back at her and then at the young rider and then at the field he had just started turning over and then back at Yatul, and there was only one answer that was ever possible. "Let me pack the saddlebags," he said. They rode south through 3 days of early spring country. Savet in the lead and Owen and Yatul riding side by side behind him, through the long greening valleys and the rocky switchbacks of the southern ridge approaches. They talked as they rode, the way they had talked all winter, openly and without performance, but there was a new quality to it now, the ease of people who had spoken the true things and had nothing left to maintain. He told her that he would like to stay in the ridge country, that the homestead was what he had built his life toward, and he wanted to see it through to something real, a working farm, maybe eventually a small operation with enough animals to trade. She listened to this and told him that the ridge territory was as much orc land as human land, that her grandmother had been born in the mountains that overlooked his property, that she had spent her life moving between territories and was not opposed to the idea of stopping. "You are thinking about staying," he said. "I am thinking about it," she said, which was as direct as she had ever been. They made camp each night together under the wide spring sky, and on the second night when the fire was burning and Savet had fallen into the exhausted sleep of a 17-year-old who had been riding for a week, Yatul moved beside Owen on the blanket and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they looked at the stars through the pines in the kind of silence that does not need to be filled. "I have been thinking about what you said in March," she said. "Which part?" "That you would not want me to choose this unless I was choosing it cleanly." She turned to look at him in the firelight. "I want you to know that I did, that I do. Whatever Verk says tomorrow, whatever the clan says about the mark, it does not change what I am choosing." He looked at her face in the firelight, the scar on her cheek catching the light in the way it always did, the amber eyes steady and clear. "I know," he said, "and for what it is worth, I have been making the same choice every morning since January." She was quiet for a moment. Then she kissed him, and it was different from the first kiss by the fire, less tentative, more settled. The kiss of people who have stopped wondering and started knowing. And he held her in the warm spring dark and felt the whole world go very quiet and very right. The Bloodhorn winter camp at Godsfall Creek was a sprawling collection of hide tents and fire circles set along the creek bank, where the willows were just beginning to come into green. There were perhaps 60 people in the camp, and Owen was aware as they rode in that he was the only human in a considerable radius, and that the awareness was mutual. He rode in straight-backed and calm beside Yatul, and she rode beside him with her chin up and her amber eyes level, and they went through the camp toward the central fire, where a very old woman sat on a carved chair that had clearly been carried a long way and placed with care. Grandmother Verk was ancient in the way that certain people became ancient, not diminished but concentrated, as if time had burned away everything inessential and left only the most durable core. Her skin was the deep gray-green of old mountain pine, and her tusks were worn and ivory yellow, and her eyes were the same amber as Yatul's. She watched them come with those eyes, and she did not speak until they had dismounted and stood before her. "Yatul," she said, in the orc tongue that Owen could not follow. Then she looked at Owen and switched to human tongue with the ease of someone who had been doing it for decades. "Owen Chandler," she said. "You have been housing and sheltering my granddaughter since the first snow. Yes, Owen said. And you are here now, she said, in the tone of a woman drawing a conclusion she has already reached. She looked at the two of them standing side by side, and something in her face, which had been very still and formal, shifted very slightly. I know why you came, she said to Yatul, back in Orc tongue. Then back to Owen, sit. They sat on the ground in front of her fire, and the elder of the Bloodhorn clan looked at Owen Chandler with a measuring gaze that made Durance's territorial committee look very small indeed. She carries a claim mark, Verk said. I know, Owen said. Do you know what it means? He told her what Yatul had told him, the two curved lines and the three marks, the permanent bond, the bidirectional claim. Verk listened to this and then said, and you misread it. Owen blinked. I beg your pardon. When you first saw it, you thought it was a wound. He felt the heat on the back of his neck again. Yes, he said, I did, for about 30 seconds. The elder looked at him for a long moment. Then, very slowly and with the full weight of 80 years of judgment behind it, she smiled. It was not a small smile. It was the smile of a woman who has seen a great many things and found this particular thing to be, in some essential way, exactly right. She did not correct you immediately, Verk said. No, Owen agreed. She let you try to help her before she told you the truth. He had not thought about it quite this way before. I suppose she did. Verk looked at Yatul with an expression that was deeply knowing and deeply fond. She has already decided, the elder said. Before she came back, before she sent for me, she had already made her claim. Yatul met the elder's eyes without flinching. Yes, she said. A claim mark goes both ways, Verk said, now to Owen again. Breck is gone. The claim between them is ended in the way that death ends things, but a woman who bears a claim mark does not lose the power of the thing. The mark remains on her face and the power of claiming remains in her. The old eyes moved between them. She has already claimed you. She had already decided from before she reached your door that first night. Owen looked at Yatul. She looked back at him with those open amber eyes and said, quietly and clearly, I had been watching you for 2 days from the ridge, before I came down. I had watched you work and the way you spoke to your horses and the way you built your fire and the way you moved in your country, and I had decided. He was quiet for a moment, taking this in, feeling the weight and completeness of it. You chose me, he said, before I even saw you. I chose the kind of man I wanted to choose, she said, and you were that man. Owen looked at her face, the scar, the amber eyes, the quiet certainty in the set of her jaw. Then I am very glad I did not disappoint you, he said. Verk watched this exchange with the expression of someone who has been proven right about something they were already certain of. She reached into the folds of her robes and drew out a small bone-handled knife and a clay pot of dark pigment, and she looked at Owen Chandler with 8 decades of authority in her eyes. The Bloodhorn tradition, she said, recognizes claims in both directions. You have been claimed. You may also claim, if it is your intention. Owen looked at the knife and the pigment. He looked at Yatul, who was watching him with an expression that was stripped of everything except the truth of what she felt. Tell me what I need to do, he said. Verk told him. The mark was different from Yatul's, designed for a human face, the same meaning in a form that would carry on his skin as a deliberate and permanent thing. It would be read by every orc who saw it, and by a great many humans in the frontier territories, where such traditions had bled across the cultural line over a century of hard living together. He held out his right arm, not his face, which was where the tradition offered a choice cheek or forearm, a public statement or an intimate one. He chose the forearm, and he did not flinch when the knife made its mark, and when the pigment was pressed into the lines, and Verk sat back with the satisfaction of someone who has completed something important. Yatul reached forward and took his arm in both her hands and looked at the mark on his skin. The same precise lines. The same 3 marks between them. Mine, she said, so quietly that only he could hear it. Yours, he said. She lifted his arm and pressed her lips to the mark, and he felt the warmth of that all the way to the center of his chest. They stayed 3 days in the Bloodhorn camp, and Owen discovered things about the world he had been living in for 5 years that he had not previously understood. The way the clan functioned, the old routes that crossed through his trapping territory that the Bloodhorn hunters used, and that he had been seeing traces of without knowing what they were. The history of the creek valleys and the mountain passes that Yatul's grandmother knew in the specific way that people knew things they had been living in for 8 decades. Verk was formidable and exacting and occasionally terrifying, and by the 3rd day she was calling Owen by his first name and asking his opinion about the spring condition of the Redstone Pass, with the interest of someone who valued a ground-level assessment from a man who knew the territory. He discovered that several of the clan, particularly the younger ones, were watching the claim marks with the focused attention of people recalibrating a complex equation. He was not naive enough to think that all of it was warm or uncomplicated. Breck's brother, a broad man named Jorek who watched Owen across the campfires with an expression that was not friendly, was a presence Owen noted and respected without being intimidated by. On the second evening, Jorek came and sat across from Owen at the fire without ceremony and said, in good human tongue, "You understand you are taking on something that will not be simple." "Yes," Owen said. "The ridge territory, the human towns, the history between our people." "Yes," Owen said again. Jorek looked at him steadily. "He was my brother, he was a good man, she loved him." "I know," Owen said quietly. "I am not trying to erase that." The silence held for a moment. Then Jorek said, "She looks different than when she left. Easier." He said it with the particular difficulty of someone acknowledging something they did not entirely want to acknowledge. "Whatever you are doing, it is good for her." Owen nodded. "I intend to keep doing it," he said. Jorek looked at the fire for a long moment. Then he stood and walked back into the camp without another word, which was about as close to a blessing as Owen suspected he was going to get from that direction, and he was inclined to count it. When they rode north again on the 4th morning, Savet accompanying them for the first day's ride before turning back, Yatul rode beside Owen through the Spring Valley country with the sun warm on the green slopes and the creek running silver below the trail, and there was something different in the way she sat her horse, a quality of arrival, as if she had been riding toward this for a long time and had finally gotten there. He felt it too. The mark on his forearm was still tender under his sleeve, and it was the most grounding sensation he had felt in years, the particular comfort of a permanent thing. They got back to the homestead in late April, and Owen finished breaking the field and planted the first seed crop, while Yatul worked the horses and finished the saddle she had been building all winter and began a new piece of leather work that she did not explain, and that he did not ask about because he had learned that some of her work was its own private process. Silas Holt came over in early May, and the three of them sat in the yard in the first real warmth of the year and drank the beer Silas had been brewing all winter and talked about the spring and the trail conditions and the market at Mirwood. And at some point, Silas looked at Owen's forearm where the sleeve had ridden up and looked at the mark on it and then looked at Yatul and then back at Owen and said, with the economy of a man who thought carefully before speaking, "Well then." "Well then," Owen agreed. Silas drank his beer. "Good," he said, which was the entirety of Silas Holt's capacity for sentiment, and Owen found it entirely sufficient. The trouble from Calderford came in June, and it came not from Durrance or the committee, but from a more random and therefore more difficult direction. 3 men, not local, passing through on the Calderford road, stopped at the homestead to water their horses and found Yatul working in the yard alone and decided, as certain men did, that her being alone changed the rules. Owen was in the field and heard her voice, which did not panic but which had a particular clipped precision that he had learned, over the months, meant she was managing something that required force of will, and he came out of the field at a walk that became a run when he saw the configuration of it. 3 men on horses arranged in the yard around Yatul, one of them with a grip on Fenn's bridle, as if testing whether the horse would be taken. Owen came through the yard gate with his rifle in his hand, and he did not raise it. He held it at low ready with the ease of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, and he walked to stand beside Yatul, and he looked at the three men on their horses and said, in the level, not quite quiet voice that carried authority without volume, "Let go of the bridle." The man on Fenn's bridle let go. "This is my property and this is my family," Owen said, and the word family landed with the same weight as the word lady had in Mirrorwood, a plain statement that required active disagreement to challenge. "You have watered your horses. The road is north." They went north. Yatul looked at the rifle in Owen's hand and then at his face, and he looked back at her, and she put her hand on his arm over the mark and held it there for a moment. "My family," she said, repeating his word back to him with a particular quiet intensity. "Yes," he said. He covered her hand with his. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You came running." "Of course I did." She squeezed his arm and turned back to the yard work with the set of her jaw that he had come to read as her version of composure under impact, the emotion absorbed and held and processed in her own time. He stood there for a moment longer, watching her work, the mark on his arm warm under her retreating hand, and then he went back to the field. That night, after supper and after the long conversation had moved through its various territories and arrived at a comfortable quiet, Yatul stood from the table and came around to his side of it and stood in front of him, and he looked up at her from his chair, and she bent down and kissed him with a thoroughness and a deliberateness that was new and unmistakable. When she drew back, she looked at him with those amber eyes fully open and said, "I want you to know that I am done being careful." Something in Owen's chest went entirely warm. "I know what that means," he said. "Good," she said, and she took his hand and led him across the room. The fire burned low in the cabin that night while the spring air moved through the cracked window, and the candle on the table guttered softly in the draught, and whatever passed between them in the dark was warm and unhurried and deeply, quietly serious. Not the first time, but the first time as a full choosing, both of them fully present, the months of careful building and earned trust and spoken truth, paying out into something tender and real and binding in its own way that had nothing to do with marks, and everything to do with the people they had become to each other. He woke before dawn to the pale blue light of early morning and found her watching the window, and he propped himself up on his elbow and looked at her face in that light and thought that there was no version of the rest of his life that made sense without this person in it. She turned her head and looked at him. "I am going to build you a proper room," he said, "off the north wall, with a real window that faces the mountains." She looked at him for a moment. "You are planning home improvements." "At dawn," he agreed. "Yes," she smiled. The real smile, the one she kept for moments when she was too happy to maintain the composure she had carried all her life like armor, and it transformed her face into something that Owen thought every person on earth deserved to see once, just once, because it was that kind of beautiful. He kissed her forehead and she leaned into him, and they lay together in the early light, while the ridge mountains turned gold outside the window, and the creek ran its cold course behind the homestead, and the horses shifted in the outbuilding, and the world was as settled and good as it had any right to be. The rest of the spring and summer was a long season of work and building, both literal and otherwise. Owen added the room off the north wall with help from Silas and a young ridge settler named Petrick who had worked construction at the coast and knew how to fit stones properly, and it went up over 3 weekends of good weather, solid and square with a window that faced the mountain range exactly as promised. Yatul chose the window placement. She stood in the frame of the unfinished room on a June morning while Owen and Silas were still laying the north wall stones, and she looked at the line of mountains above the pine trees and said where the window should go with the same authority she brought to everything. And Silas looked at Owen, and Owen looked at Silas, and they moved the window, and it was in exactly the right place. She made the room her own in ways that were small and precise and entirely Yatul. A leather-worked panel hung on the wall above the sleeping platform with Orc clan pattern pressed into the border, a clay oil lamp on the sill that she had traded for at Mirrorwood, and that burned with a particular warm smell of mountain pine resin, a pair of her grandmother's beads on a cord above the door. The room was hers, and the cabin was theirs, and Owen had never been more grateful for the specific dimensions of his life. The market trouble with Gorton in Calderford did not fully resolve so much as it arrived at an equilibrium. Owen had gone back to Calderford in May with Yatul riding openly beside him, and Gorton had looked at the mark on Owen's forearm where his sleeve was rolled back in the warm day, and had opened his mouth and closed it again, because enough people in the Calderford market had heard about Owen Chandler and his position on the matter that openly antagonizing a paying customer over his business had become a more calculated risk than it was worth to Gorton's commercial interests. It was not warmth. It was not acceptance. It was the grudging accommodation of the practical, which in frontier country often turned into something closer to acceptance over time if it was not contested. Owen understood this and was patient with it, because patience was what the situation called for. A woman at the dry goods stall, a widow named Merritt who ran the stall with her sister, was the first person in Calderford to use Yatul's name. She looked at Yatul over the stall counter and said, "Yatul Bloodhorn, I have heard about you. You did the leather work on Aldrich's saddle at Misread." And when Yatul said yes, Merritt said, "He has shown it to everyone who passes through. Do you take commissions?" And the conversation that followed was entirely about the quality of stitching on curved saddle cantle frames, and Owen stood beside it and felt something very much like hope. Verk came north in July with a small party, moving through the summer territory, and stopped at the homestead for 2 days. Owen cooked more food than he had cooked in a single effort in his entire life, and Verk ate it with the focused appreciation of someone who was not going to say it was good because she did not say unnecessary things, but who ate 3 portions, which was the same. The old elder walked the property on the second morning, slowly and with the authority of someone performing an assessment, and she walked the field and the outbuilding and the north room and the yard, and she stood at the fence line and looked at the mountains, and then she turned to Owen, who had followed at a respectful distance, and she said, "She will be useful to you here." "She already is," Owen said, "though I would note that is not the primary reason I want her here." Verk looked at him with those ancient amber eyes. "I know," she said. "I am telling you the additional truth." She paused. "She has Bloodhorn tracking land in this range. The mountain passes north of your property. It is her birthright territory. No one has used it in 20 years. Owen absorbed this. "Are you telling me she belongs here?" "I am telling you the land already knew her before she knocked on your door," Verk said, with the tone of someone who considered this a complete and sufficient statement. She left the next morning with her party, and Yatul watched them go from the yard with an expression that was both sad and settled, the expression of a woman who had made a full peace with the life she had chosen. Owen came to stand beside her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they watched the party move south through the morning light. "She approves," Yatul said. "I know," Owen said. "She rarely approves of anything. I got that impression." Yatul made the not-quite-laugh sound. "She ate 3 portions of your stew. I noticed." They stood in the yard as the figures disappeared into the tree line and the morning birdsong came back, and the ridge country was as beautiful and as specific and as theirs as it had ever been. By autumn they had established a pattern that worked in both the practical and the profound. Owen ran the trapping and the planting and the horse trade that was beginning to build, because word had gotten around that the Chandler homestead had good horses and a man who knew how to work with a difficult animal, and a woman who could assess a horse's physical condition with extraordinary precision, and people came from as far as Misread and occasionally from Calderford to look at the stock. Yatul ran the leatherwork operation that had grown, over the summer, from a personal craft into something that had an actual order list, with a commission from Misread for a full saddle set and 2 individual commissions from the Calderford market, one from Merritt's sister's husband and one, quietly and without announcement, from Gorton himself, who had apparently looked at enough good work to override his other opinions when money was involved. The day Gorton's commission came in, Owen had to leave the cabin quickly because he could not let Yatul see how hard he was laughing. He made it to the outbuilding before it overwhelmed him, and March the bay gelding looked at him with considerable equine concern while he got himself under control. He told Yatul that evening, and she looked at him with an expression of pure, flat disbelief, and then she said, "If I put extra charge on the buckle work, is that stealing?" "Strictly speaking, yes," Owen said. "Worth it," she said. He laughed again, and she allowed herself to laugh too. And it was the kind of laughter that came from deep in the chest and filled a room. And afterward, he reached across the table and took her hand and held it, and she turned her hand in his, and held it back, and neither of them needed to say what they were feeling because it was already in the room. The first full winter they spent together as a settled pair was different from the first winter she had arrived into, and the difference was in the specific quality of warmth. The cabin had its new room and the north wall window that faced the mountains, and the fire burned in the evenings with the lamp lit on the sill, and Owen and Yatul moved through the domestic rhythms of a shared life, with the ease of people who had discovered that sharing a life is easier than they had expected and more rewarding than they had imagined. They fought occasionally, real arguments, about practical matters, and occasionally about deeper ones. And they were both stubborn in their own particular ways, and the arguments were sometimes heated and always eventually resolved, because they had both decided that this was what they wanted, and that deciding it meant working through the hard parts rather than retreating from them. Owen had a tendency, she told him in one such argument, to make decisions about protecting her without asking her whether she wanted to be protected in that particular way. She was right. He acknowledged it without deflection and changed the behavior, and she appreciated both the acknowledgement and the change with the directness she brought to all of it, saying plainly, "Thank you. That is what I needed," and meaning it. She had a tendency, he told her in another argument, to preemptively assume that he would not understand things about her world, and to therefore not tell him things he needed to know to help her. She was quiet for a long time after this, and then she said, "I have spent 24 years explaining myself to people who did not want to understand, and I am still unlearning the assumption that explanation is wasted effort." He held her hand across the table. "I am not those people," he said. "I know," she said. "I am learning to live like you are not." They got through the winter, and through the next one, and through each one that followed, building the kind of life that could not be built quickly or on paper, only in the specific daily accumulation of shared work and shared meals and shared decision-making and shared warmth in the dark hours. In the spring 2 years after Yatul had walked out of the pine tree line with the scar on her cheek and the torn clasp on her cloak and the wariness in her amber eyes, they were married. Not in the Calderford church, which they did not particularly want and which did not particularly want them, but in the yard of the homestead with Silas Holt as witness and a traveling justice of the peace, who was one of the practical ones, and grandmother Verk, who had come north again for the season, and who stood at the edge of the gathering with the expression of a woman who had known this was going to happen before either of the principals did. It was a morning ceremony, and Owen wore his best shirt and Yatul wore new leather she had made herself over the winter, the same leather bodice design but new, fresh tanned and etched along the borders with a pattern that included, very small, in the inner edge where only she and Owen would know it was there, a version of the Bloodhorn claim mark. She told him about it afterward. He pressed his fingers against the edge of the leather to feel where it was, and she put her hand over his hand, and they stood in the yard in the spring light with the mountains bright above the tree line, and everything resolved between them in the way that things resolve when two people stop being separate stories and become one. "You put the claim on your own leathers," he said. "It seemed appropriate," she said. He turned her hand over and pressed his lips to the inside of her wrist, and she leaned her forehead against his jaw, and the spring birds were loud in the birch trees by the creek, and the ridge country stretched in every direction, Theirs in the way that a place becomes yours when you have put enough of yourself into it. The years settled in and grew. The horse operation expanded, and Owen added a second outbuilding for the increased stock, and Yatul's leatherwork reputation spread to the point where she had a waiting list that ran into the following year. Silas Holt married a woman named Corin who had come through on a wagon train and decided to stop, and the two homesteads 4 miles apart began to function something like a small community, with the easy shared labor and shared meals of people who have decided to be each other's nearest neighbors in the genuine sense. Calderford did not transform overnight. The transformation was slower and more complicated than that, more like the way the ridge landscape changed over the seasons, imperceptible on any given day but entirely different across a year. Marrett at the dry goods stall became genuinely warm. A young man who worked at the farrier's began stopping by the Chandler place to learn horse handling from Yatul, which his father, the farrier, permitted because the farrier was an honest tradesman who cared more about the quality of what his son learned than the identity of the teacher. Even Gorton, who never became warm and never became easy, ceased to be openly antagonistic, which in a man like Gorton represented a real journey. Durrance and his committee came back once in the second year with a new complaint that Owen dismantled in 2 sentences by pointing out the specific territorial law that governed private homestead rights, which he had looked up the previous winter in a deliberate and unhurried way, and which left Durrance with nothing but his own bad opinion and nowhere to put it. In the 3rd year, Yatul told Owen she was carrying their child. She told him in the morning, before they got up, lying beside him in the north room with the mountain window showing the first gray light over the peaks, and she said it with a characteristic flat directness that was the form her particular kind of vulnerability took, and he pulled her in close and pressed his face into her hair and said nothing for a long time, because there was too much to say for any of it to come first. She laughed softly against his chest. "I expected more words from you," she said. "I am thinking," he said thickly. "Think quietly then." He held her while the light grew and the mountains went from gray to gold, and the creek sounded in its familiar course behind the homestead, and he thought about the boy or girl who would be born in this place, into this particular life, into a world that was going to be complicated about them, and that he intended to make as uncomplicated as possible, one day at a time, the way he had done everything worth doing. "I am very happy," he said when he trusted his voice. "I know," she said. "I am too." Their son was born in the late autumn of that year, in the north room with the mountain window, with a midwife from Mirawood and grandmother Verk who had arrived, with what Owen now accepted was her characteristic prescience about timing, 3 weeks early, and installed herself in the cabin's main room with a settled authority that made it clear she would be staying until the child came. He was green-skinned, their son, the particular sage green of his mother, but with his father's hazel in the eyes that would later decide they were predominantly amber, and with the beginning of the small nubs at his lower jaw that would one day be modest tusks, and with 10 fingers and 10 toes and Owen's specific nose, which was apparently a dominant trait. They named him Breck, for the one who had come before and was owed a name spoken forward with love rather than grief, and Verk, hearing this, made the sound that was her version of being moved, which sounded to Owen like a very quiet exhale through the nose but which Yatul translated as, "Grandmother approves entirely." He was a healthy, fierce, opinionated baby who slept badly and ate well, and who treated the world with the same fundamental assessment that his mother treated it with, the same amber gaze cataloging and measuring, except that in his case the cataloging was currently limited to the cabin and the yard and the horses, which he adored from the moment he could be carried out to them, and which adored him back in the particular way horses reserve for small, loud creatures who smell like family. Jorek came north in the child's first summer. He stood in the yard holding his nephew for the first time and looked at the baby's face, and his brother's name being worn by this small mixed-blood boy in the middle of a human frontier homestead, and he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, He has Breck's ears, which was a generous statement of uncertain accuracy, but which Owen understood was the fullest gift Jarak was capable of offering, and he took it as such. The years piled up warm and useful. A second child came, a daughter with her father's coloring and her mother's strength, and they named her Reth for no reason except that Yatul had known a woman named Reth who had been good and capable and kind, and had died young, and it seemed right to put the name back into the world in good form. She was pink-skinned where her brother was green, and she had Owen's straight brown hair and her mother's tusks in miniature, barely perceptible until she was 3, and then suddenly visible when she smiled her wide, shameless, sunny smile. Their children grew up knowing both worlds. They were Ridge children and Bloodhorn children. They moved between the homestead and the clan's seasonal camps with the ease of people who had always belonged to more than one place. And they learned the tracking and the leather work, and the horse handling and the planting and the human tongue and the orc tongue, and the old Bloodhorn clan songs that Verk sang on winter evenings, and the quiet practical wisdom of a man who had chosen, repeatedly and deliberately, to be the kind of person who opened the door. Owen's arm carried its mark and Yatul's cheek carried hers, and the children grew up looking at those marks as ordinary parts of the faces they loved best, the same way they grew up looking at the mountains through the north window and the creek through the birch trees and the particular quality of light on the ridge in the early morning as ordinary, unremarkable, foundational. The world they were made of. One evening, 15 years after the first snow, Owen and Yatul sat on the step of the homestead in the last of the summer light, watching Breck and Reth race the horses in the far field, the thunder of hooves carrying clearly in the still evening air, both children brilliant and quick and entirely themselves. The horses moved in long, easy arcs around the field, and the mountains were copper above the tree line, and the first stars were appearing over the eastern peaks. Yatul leaned against Owen's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and she reached up and covered his hand with hers. "I was standing in the tree line for 2 days," she said, not the first time she had told him, but telling it again in the way you revisit the origin of things. "Watching you work, deciding." "I know," he said. "I watched you talk to your horses," she said. "That was the thing that decided it. You talked to them the way you talk to people, without performing." He looked at the field, at the 2 young people riding in the copper light. "Good instinct," he said. She made the sound, the low, warm, not quite laugh that was one of the most particular and beloved sounds in the world to him after 15 years. "I thought you were going to try to medicine my face," she said. "I was going to medicine your face," he said. "I thought you were hurt." "You thought I was hurt," she agreed. "I was not wrong about everything," he said, "just the specific cause." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Verk told me that summer after the camp that you misreading the mark was the best thing that could have happened. She said a man who sees a scar and reaches for medicine is a man worth knowing." Owen thought about Verk, who had died the previous winter in the mountain camp at the age of 86, surrounded by the clan with Yatul at her side, and who had said near the end that the ridge territory was better for what Owen and Yatul had put into it, which was as close to a declaration of love as the old elder had ever managed, and which had undone Yatul entirely, quietly, with the specific grief of losing someone who was finally, fully saying the thing. "She was a remarkable woman," Owen said. "The best," Yatul said simply. They sat in the last of the evening light while the children brought the horses in, and the field went dark, and the stars built overhead, and the homestead behind them was lit warm from within. The lamp on the north window sill, and the fire in the main room, and the smell of the supper they had left cooling on the table. And the mountains were turning from copper to gray to black, range behind range into the darkness. The territory that had always been here and that was now, fully and finally, and without qualification, theirs. Owen turned his head and pressed his lips to Yatul's temple, and she turned her face to his, and they looked at each other in the last light with 15 years behind them and all the years ahead. And what was in her amber eyes was the thing that had been building since before she had come out of the tree line, since before she had sat at his table and eaten his stew, since before she had touched his hand on the map and not moved away. It was the complete and settled certainty of a woman who had chosen what she wanted with the full weight of herself, and had found, to her bone-deep satisfaction, that it was everything she had assessed it to be. "Strange man," she said softly, the echo of the first night. "Strange life," he agreed. She smiled. The real one, the one she kept for moments when she was too happy to hold it in. He smiled back. The mountains went dark and the stars went brilliant, and the creek ran its cold course, and the lamp burned warm in the north window. And in the full dark, the Chandler homestead sat solid and real at the foot of the broken ridge as it always had and always would, built by two sets of hands out of two worlds, carrying two names and two marks, and the particular, irreplaceable warmth of a life that had chosen itself clearly and fully and without hesitation.